Let's talk about multimodality. It may seem like a highfalutin concept, but it's actually really simple.
For instance, digital text production is rooted in multimodal creation. In fact, most of the texts we interact with on a day-to-day basis have an expectation for multimodality.
Moreover, by virtue of your generational position, many of you already are, super literate at reading multimodal texts, analyzing multimodal texts, and even creating multimodal texts.
And texts that are less multimodal are rapidly being phased out of our cultural lexicon.
Multimodality describes texts that use multiple modes of sensory appeal to convey information to their audience.
In analyzing multimodal texts, we use 5 key modes to describe how these appeals are being made. There's linguistic, which has to do with the use of words and language; visual, which has to do with images; aural, which has to do with sounds; spatial, which has to do with the spatial relationships between the different elements at play; and gestural, things like body language, tone.
Meaning, when we encounter a text that's using different modes of sensory appeal, we want to think about why these different appeals are being made. In general, we think about information and how different appeals convey different kinds of information, different volumes of information, or information to different audiences. You've all heard the phrase, "a picture is worth 1,000 words," but what does that really mean?
It means that when you read an account of an event, the details are being selected by the author, and the language used to describe those details is subjective.
Whereas a photograph allows you to determine for yourself
which details of an event you want to focus on and what language you want to use to describe them. Imagine then the volume of information present in a feature film, 90 plus minutes of images running at thousands of frames per second.
Then imagine the myriad of different viewings of that film that arise when the film is watched by millions of people. This is the value of thinking about multimodality. It allows us to consider with more intention the modes of communication that we use to convey information, but it also allows us to see ways of marrying form and content when we create texts. This impulse to tie multimodality to digital text creation is intuitive, but it's worth mentioning that multimodality is, an ancient concept.
Whenever the impulse to first combine language or image or gesture while speaking struck man, that was the beginnings of multimodal communication.
So before we think about digital text production in creating multimodal communications, let's look at how some different print texts use multimodality. This is They Say, I Say, and it's a pretty low-level version of a multimodal text. It's something that you should all be familiar with. First we have the spatial layout that helps us to understand the flow of information, but also we've got some images added in to give the idea that, maybe this isn't like every other textbook that you've read, although in all likelihood, it probably is. Whereas this book, Beat Culture and the New America, compiled by, you can see the Whitney Museum of American Art here, tries to take what feels like a museum or gallery exhibit and put it into book form. You can see we have historical photos here of different events in the Beat movement. Here are a collection of authors gathered outside city lights, but we also have representations of Beat art as well. And similar to what you would see in a gallery or a museum, with the contextual information for the art positioned right next to it so that you can get context for what you're looking at. This is a very good representation of the idea of form and content being married. This is supposed to feel like you're walking through an exhibit at the Whitney Museum, and in many ways, it does. This is The Watchmen. It's a graphic novel. And in many ways, graphic novels kind of exemplify this idea of marrying form and content simply by existing the way that they do. You'll see here the structure of the pages dictates how we read the story. And so the narrative and the visual structure of each page, they're inextricable from one another. But there's other interesting multimodal aspects of graphic novels too. The idea that this is dialogue spoken by characters. Do we hear that as we read? Do the characters have maybe different voices to us depending on what we learn about them visually from the images that we see or the aspects of their character that they present us throughout the course of the novel? I'm not sure. Here we have Leslie Marmon Silko's Storyteller, and this is another really interesting example because what Marmon Silko is trying to do with this book is to fuse a number of different kinds of texts into one text that is representative of her tribe, which would be the Lakota Native Americans, her tribe's approach to storytelling in the oral tradition. Leslie Marmon Silko is not just a poet and essayist and fiction writer. Well, all of those modes are contained in this book, but she's also a photographer as well. And we know that a key aspect of Native American culture is the relationships that Native American people cultivated with the land of this continent. And so this idea of giving a physical representation or a visual representation of that relationship through photographs, I think, is strong. And lastly, here we have Mark Danielewski's House of Leaves, which does a lot of interesting things with multimodality. You can see just looking at each page of the book, this is supposed to be a novel, but it doesn't look like any novel that you've likely seen before, just from a standpoint of how it is visually structured and laid out. But beyond that, House of Leaves is a metatextual kind of artifact in that the story itself is being written by a person who has discovered a manuscript that nobody has ever read before, and they are annotating and commenting on this manuscript as they work through it. And what the manuscript is about is a documentary film that has been lost to time and that no one has access to anymore. So here you have a number of different textual approaches being used to kind of communicate the relationship between these different fictional texts that go into the building of this novel. The clear relevance of this topic to our work in this course is that, in Module 2, you're going to be asked to create a Web 2.0 project that exists and lives in some kind of digital space. So acknowledging this concept now allows us to consider the multimodal opportunities available to us.
But I think we should consider each of the projects we complete in this class as opportunities to use multimodality, from the major projects to your comments on our discussions in Discord.
It creates an interesting set of questions for each project.
For instance, what usage of visual space will make your paper revision more persuasive?
Can documentation gesture?
Or what if you could hear a white paper?
Let's talk about it on Discord. Post some links to different multimodal digital texts, and we'll talk about them.